Like many families in America, my parents hail from different parts of the world. My mother was raised in a family with deep roots in the South. And what this meant was my grandmother was an extreme racist and an anti-Semite. She actually was a Holocaust denier, which is kind of ironic given that my mother married my father, who is part Hungarian Jew. Now, my grandmother, she had no knowledge of this. Had she known, she would have never allowed my mother to marry my father. But the reason she didn't know is because my grandfather had changed his name when he graduated from college. So his original name was Lefkowitz, and his professor came to him and said, look, there's anti-Semitism everywhere. He's like, you're never going to be able to find a job with that name. So he went and he changed his name to Lang. So my grandfather tries to hide his Jewish heritage, and his son ends up marrying into a family with anti-Semitic sentiments. Isn't it interesting how love doesn't really care about our identity? That love just melts away all those distinctions? And yet, at the same time, we crave identity. Humans are very tribal. We want to know that we are part of a group of people who accept us for who we are and sees the world in much the same way we do. And so there's this tension that exists in our lives. On the one hand, we want to feel connected. We want to feel part of a group. On the other hand, we want to feel loved, and we want to feel that we are cared for. What I've discovered is that identity is not always concerned with love, and love is not always concerned with identity. Let me give you an example of what I mean. When Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, like many people around the world, I was shocked at the severe and indiscriminate brutality of those attacks. And my Jewish side really resonated with Israel's need to hunt down those perpetrators and bring them to justice. But by the end of November, what became clear to me is that the Israeli army wasn't just targeting Hamas. They were leveling whole neighborhoods. They were destroying crucial infrastructure, like power plants and sewage systems and hospitals, and they were preventing the distribution of humanitarian aid. The more this happened, the more my heart for the people of Gaza overrode my Jewish identity. How I felt about Hamas attacking Israel was now how I felt for the people of Gaza. They were the targets of severe and indiscriminate brutality. Both Hamas and Israel are in the wrong, and it's the ordinary person with no power who suffers the consequences. So what we're going to talk about in this final episode of season 1 of Kokoro is the concept of identity. Where does identity come from? Why is it important? When is identity good for us? When is it bad? And how do we navigate the tension between the loyalty we feel to our identity and the love we feel for those outside of our tribe? To begin talking about this, I want to introduce you to two people who have had to navigate this dynamic in ways that few of us can understand. Will you join me in the kitchen? Well, I want to welcome Anna and John to Kokoro. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So normally I prepare the meal for the show, but today you all have prepared it. And so can you tell me a little bit about what it is that we're eating?
Yeah, we're eating traditional Ukrainian food called borscht, and it's made out of the vegetables that usually grow in the Ukrainian land, on the Ukrainian soil. So it's carrots, beets, potato, onion. Did I forget something?
That's about right.
Yeah, so it's mostly that. It's actually vegetarian today, so no meat, but usually we would add meat there too. And it's very fulfilling, and you can eat it the whole year long, and it will taste good.
Is there a way that we should be eating it, first of all?
Yes.
Okay, so tell me what we need to be doing. How do
So we have a sour cream. This is like basic set of how you to eat borscht.
Real Ukrainians do 2 scoops.
Yeah, 2 scoops, 2 scoops eggs. Yeah, absolutely. I would do 3 sometimes. Because sour cream is a big part of our culture. In every dish, almost every dish that you would have in Ukraine, you would have something, some dairy served with it. So, and you can just say smachnoho, which means bon appetit in Ukrainian.
So smishno?
Smachnoho.
Smashnoho?
Super, good pronunciation. A spoon and just go ahead. How is it?
It's really tasty. Wow. I'm super impressed. So Hannah, what were you doing before the war in Ukraine?
So before the war in Ukraine, I has been doing ceramic there. This is one of my specialties. That's what I do. And we had this news that tanks are gathering on the border. And none of my friends actually believed that it's something would start, but I had the feeling. So I went to Thailand 2 months before the full-scale invasion, and I left my ceramic studio to my partner / student at the time. When I was leaving, I literally say goodbye to everything I had. I boxed all my stuff, put it in Baron's house. I just say goodbyes, I think, for the first time to Ukraine, because I was so worried that something really horrible would happen.
Ukraine and Russia have these very interwoven histories together. Can you talk a little bit about how the invasion affected your sense of identity as a Ukrainian?
The real Ukrainian identity, like the Ukraine united as a nation, as people, I think only after 24th of February 2022, when the full-scale invasion happened. Before that, I mean, almost every Ukrainian family have relatives in Russia, so we were always interlaced with them. And I had myself a family in Russia. I still have, but we are not really staying that in touch because it's little blind spot.
You know, you have a family that is somewhat divided on this.
Yeah.
You have a family, some of your family is very pro-Ukrainian, pro-Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And then you have some of your family, close people to you, who actually are very pro-Russian in this. Can you talk a little bit about that tension and that conflict that you're dealing with?
It is very tense, I would say. And the very simple example, very close to me personally, my mom and her 2 sisters. My mom is the oldest one, and she is pro-Ukrainian, and she became even more she had this feeling of Ukrainianness, I think, in some way. She needed to flee with my brother, who was 15 at the time of the war, because if he would stay in Ukraine, he would be in the army right now, and maybe that already. But for example, her middle sister has been living in Ukraine too, has been born, raised the same as my mom, but she, since 2014, she became completely pro-Russian. And for example, the younger sister, she had a house 20 kilometers from the border of Russia, and when the invasion happened, her home has been really close to the border. So her husband, their 2 little kids, 4 and 8 at the time, they saw all of this fire, explosions, jets, first thing. And her sister, middle sister, they were all close together, didn't believe a word that she said, didn't believe that this happened from the Russian side. They think that Ukrainian bombing themselves, which is a ridiculous thing to believe in.
How does that hit you, that you're doing all of this to help your people, and then yet you have your members of your own family who actually seemingly are fighting against what you're doing?
It still hurts, it's still disappointing, but I think I kind of accepted that different people have different views, have different beliefs, and you just cannot change the mind of a person that doesn't want to change their own mind. They should come to that themselves, and all we can do is be patient, not share this aggression that we receive back from Russia, and just keep treating them as the family members, even though not close ones anymore.
So John, you were working with Burmese refugees over in Thailand.
That's right.
And then that's where you two met, yes?
Yeah.
All right. And then eventually the two of you found your way back to Ukraine, where you were working with refugees of the war, particularly children who have been impacted by the war, through an organization called Novi. And so can you tell me a little bit about the work that you all do together to help these kids?
Yeah, absolutely. So since the full-scale invasion, there are still about 7 million children living in Ukraine. And in every oblast of Ukraine, there's bombings, there's missiles, there's artillery if you're closer to the front lines. And even my mental health struggles. But I can't imagine what these children are dealing with it day in and day out. And so that's sort of where Novi was born, was in a bomb shelter in Lviv, where we noticed children reacting to the stress and the trauma of the war and misbehaving. And then we witnessed parents not understanding what was going on with their children and actually disciplining their children because they were acting out. But the parents didn't understand that the child was in a reactive state of stress and didn't have control over what they were doing. And so we were there with a psychologist trying to decide what we can do, how we can help. And the psychologist said if these parents knew what was going on in the bodies of their children, what was going on in their brains, they wouldn't be disciplining them right now. So our mission is restoring childhoods disrupted by war. And that's what we're all about.
I mean, that's an amazing mission to have. You know, what kind of healing are you able to create to help them form an identity, a positive, nurturing identity of self that is maybe differentiated somewhat from the violence that they're seeing?
One of the main ways that we work with kids to help them learn how to self-regulate is with a tool called the Novi Life Kit. It's basically just a backpack filled with toys. The idea is that when a child is in the state of fight and flight, which we call the red zone when we're working with kids, or freeze, which is what we call the blue zone, they can play these games. There's about 400 games that were developed by psychologists with expertise in childhood trauma. And they can play these activities, and to them, it just feels like games. Maybe jump rope, or blowing bubbles, or playing Twister. And so for them, they're just playing, but in their bodies are self-regulating, and they're finding that green zone, which is homeostasis. That's where their bodies can heal, that's where their brains can heal, and that's where they can form meaningful connections with their family. Because that's the other thing, is their mental health doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in relationship to their parents, in relationship to their friends. We need them to not just be healthy, meditating people on a mountaintop. We need them to be integrated in society. And so that means socialization, that means play, that means integration with their parents and their family structure. So it's a really complex system, but this tool has really been effective in helping them learn how to self-regulate at least, and that's the first step.
Well, I just want to say that for my part, I think that what you all do is incredible. Thank you for being the ones to sacrifice yourselves, to go and to care for these children. I'm in awe of Novi. I think it's just such an amazing organization that really is doing so much good. And I hope that your program grows and that people realize that what you're doing is so incredibly necessary, so important, and that you are truly changing lives with what you do. So thank you for coming and talking with us today. And just thank you for changing the world for the better.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you
it's
for
an honor
having
to be
us.
here. Appreciate it.
We all want to be accepted. We all want to be part of a group of people who value and care for us. The question becomes, where do we find our people? Where do we find acceptance in our lives? Now, the truth is that we all find identity in a lot of different places. But generally speaking, our initial sense of belonging comes from our inherited identity, our ethnicity, our race, our nationality. Now, for many people, this is the end-all, be-all. I know that for my grandmother, who I spoke about at the beginning of this episode, heritage meant everything to her. She let my mother know in no uncertain terms that she was to marry a white, European, Protestant male from the South. This is really common among parents all across the world. They lay these expectations on their children that they should marry a certain type of person. And why do they want this? Well, they like their culture. They like being around people who they understand and who they know, who look like them and act like them. And they don't want that to change. Now, to be fair to them, this is deeply programmed within our DNA. We evolved as a species to be suspicious of outsiders because it kept us safe. When we come across someone who doesn't fit the profile of what we know to be safe, immediately flags go off in our brains. Now, I'm sure you've been in situations where those flags have kept you safe from harm. The problem with this impulse is that it's based on a judgment of the way someone looks, and we don't really know who they are as a person. Now, this impulse, it's better known as prejudice. The issue with prejudice is that it can very easily become intertwined with our identity. Anybody who looks like me is good, everyone else is bad. Now, this type of black and white thinking, it certainly makes the world easy to navigate, but it definitely comes with a lot of distrust. And that distrust, it can lead to discrimination, and discrimination, it can lead to violence, and violence can lead to war. This is why it's really important for us to open ourselves to other cultures and ways of thinking. I know that for myself, I feel very fortunate that I went to school with people who came from very different ethnicities and socioeconomic backgrounds from myself. Had I not had that exposure, I think I would have adopted the worldview of my grandmother, which is monotonous, boring, and frankly, scary, because anyone who's different is to be feared. But when you open yourself to other cultures, the world becomes a much more beautiful and welcoming place. Differences are no longer things to be feared, but rather to be embraced for what they can teach you. This is why it's so important that we adopt an identity of openness, where we live in the tension that you don't have all the answers, and neither does anyone else. But this is easier said than done. And to explain why, I want you to join me upstairs. Identity is a double-edged sword. Identity is one of the most binding forces in our world, but it's also one of the most destructive. Identity can instill in us a deep sense of belonging, but it can also instill in us a blind allegiance where we're willing to defend our tribe at all costs. Currently, there are 56 different armed conflicts happening all over the world. But the one that has captured the attention of the West is the war in Gaza. And this is a stark example of how our identity can cause us to inflict indiscriminate harm on the people around us. When Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, they murdered 1,200 people and kidnapped more than 250. Among those who were murdered were two 12-year-old twins, Leal and Hanai Hetzroni. Now Leal, she was known as being super friendly, and she was supportive of everyone around her. She had a pure heart, a huge laugh, and she loved to go crazy with her friends. Her twin brother Hanai, he was known for his warmth and humor. He was a leader among his peers, but he was also an entertainer who could brighten everyone's day with his infectious joy and laughter. Both twins were corralled into a home with a group of people by members of Hamas and were killed in mass. Now, after that gruesome day, the Israeli military started conducting strikes into Gaza. And what quickly became apparent is that they were not concerned about the collateral damage that was being caused to civilians. To date, more than 40,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza, most of whom were women and children. One of the people who was murdered was Tala Abu Ajwa, a 10-year-old girl who would survive the war for 332 days. She and her family had fled on foot 8 different times to avoid the conflict. The day before she was murdered, she was talking to her father about how she dreamed of going back to school and becoming a dentist. The day of her death, she was outside on her rollerblades, which she loved, just enjoying life, when a missile came from the sky and snuffed out her life. Now, what's the difference between Lil, Hanai, and Tala? Honestly, not that much. On a genetic level, they are virtually indistinguishable from one another. But our society, we sort people into categories based on their identities. Identities that they didn't choose for themselves, but identities that come with a long history of violence that sealed their fate. For Lil and Hanai, there is really identity. That was enough for Hamas to say, you deserve to die. For Tala, her identity as a Palestinian meant that the Israeli army felt that she was an acceptable casualty of war. And now, both families have to endure the intense pain that comes with losing a child. And that pain doesn't discriminate. That pain doesn't care about your identity. It doesn't care whether you're black, white, or Arab. It doesn't care whether you're Muslim, Jew, Christian, or atheist. Pain transcends identity, and yet it is identity that is the cause of that pain. And this is why I think it's so important that we understand that it's one thing to be proud of your heritage. It's another thing to base your entire identity around your heritage to the point where it becomes a barometer of inclusion, exclusion, love, and hate. And this is why what I talked about earlier of having an identity of openness is so incredibly important, because that's what the Kokoro community is all about. If you're looking for a community of inclusion, then you can join us every Wednesday from 7 to 8 p.m. Central Standard Time on Patreon beginning January 8th. And the way I want to end this episode is by reciting a poem entitled Your Village by Alana Bell from her book Eyes Stones, which is a collection that was created based on interviews that were conducted in Israel, the Palestinian territories, and America. Once in a village that is burning, because a village is always somewhere burning. And if you do not look, because it is not your village, it is still your village. In that village is a hollow child. You drown when he looks at you with his black, black eyes. And if you do not cry because he is not your child, he is still your child. All the animals that could run away have run away. The trapped ones make an orchestra of their hunger. The houses are ruined. Nothing grows in the garden. The grandfather's grave is there, a small stone under a shade of charred oak. Who will brush off the dead leaves? Who will call his name for morning prayer? Where will they, the ones who slept in this house and ate from this dirt? So no matter who you are, no matter where you've been, no matter how you feel, please know that you are loved, you are seen, and you are cared for, if by no one else, by me. My name is Alex Lang, and until next time.